Kaepernick is a devout Christian whose faith has turned him into an activist. Reid, Kaepernick's former teammate on the San Francisco 49ers, recently wrote an op-ed in the New York Times describing the moment that he, Reid, decided to join Kaepernick's protest last year. Reid claims it was his Christianity that moved him to take the knee. He quotes a passage, Reid does, in the Bible, which states that faith without action is dead. Now, Ephesians 2:8-9, as my grandmother taught me, disagrees with that. By grace are you saved, not by your deeds, which is more horseshit. But back to this. He quotes passages in the Bible which states that faith without action is dead. For Reid, kneeling for the anthem to bring attention to police killings of unarmed black people was an act of faith. It was just as much of an act of faith as Tebow's choice to kneel down and pray. Reid writes, quote, "I knew I needed to stand up for what is right," or kneel. From the beginning, the so-called take the knee protests have been tied to faith, the kind of righteous indignation that fueled, for example, the civil rights movement of the 1960s. But as more than 200 N.F.L. players joined the protest by refusing to stand for the national anthem this past weekend, some Christians expressed their dismay, claiming that kneeling during the anthem is an unpatriotic and ungrateful gesture. Ungrateful? But let me go on. This fissure in response to the N.F.L. protests highlights key differences between white Christians and Christians of color. These groups tend to think differently about racial justice and what Christianity should look like when it's called to action. The divide between American Christians about the so-called appropriateness of protests for black lives isn't new. In his letter from a Birmingham jail, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote about his disappointment with so-called white moderate Christian leaders and churches that claimed they agreed with King's goals, but not his methods. These Christians advised black activists to wait for, quote, a more convenient season, end quote, for equality to materialize. And let me add my own bullshit here. You know, the Christian church has always been, until some activists started to show up in the church in the 18th century, 19th century, but the church has always been an advocate. I mean, the Bible tells them that slaves should honor their masters. In other words, shut the fuck up and be a slave. But I digress. Dr. King wrote, quote, I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the White Citizens Council or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice. I'm sure you're familiar with that passage. Now, these attitudes seem to have persisted into this new century, into the 21st century. The popular Southern Baptist pastor, Robert Jeffress, that's the guy with the big-ass church in Houston, or is it Dallas? One of Trump's top evangelical advisors claimed that the NFL players should be eternally grateful to God that they live in a country where they aren't, quote, shot in the head for protesting. Can you fucking believe that? Attorney General Jefferson Butterscotch Sessions III, a staunch defender of religious liberty, said that the players should make their protest in, quote, any other place. Sessions said, quote, as a matter of propriety, of love of country and decency, you should stand when the national anthem is played, end quote. And even the Christians who agreed that the players' free speech should be protected admitted that they didn't think protesting the anthem was the, quote, best way, end quote, to advocate for justice. But for some black Christians, the flag, the anthem, and other patriotic symbols are inextricably tied to America's racist past. And the Jesus of the Bible, with his message of liberation and radical inclusivity, is seen as someone who is intimately associated with the struggle for justice by black Christians. The Reverend Tracy Blackman, a United Church of Christ pastor deeply involved with racial justice ministries, told Huffington Post that to her, the flag and the national anthem are symbolic reminders of the ideals that America has not yet realized. As a result, she says, a football game is the, quote, perfect place, end quote, for Kaepernick and others to protest. She told Huffington Post, quote, a football game is a perfect place to show the hypocrisy of our national narrative, because Americans worship football and gather weekly to watch many black bodies endure physical abuse for their pleasure, and then go home to neighborhoods where those same black bodies are not welcomed to live, end quote. Valerie Cooper, associate professor of religion and black church studies at Duke Divinity School, said that one of the ways that black churches think of Jesus is as the leader of a protest movement, someone who came to earth to proclaim good news to the poor and set the captive free. Valerie Cooper said, quote, how you respond to protest movements depends on which side of the protest you're on. There's never an appropriate venue for a protest. When civil rights activists tried to desegregate a lunch counter, people could say, don't interrupt my lunch. If you're desegregating a school, it's, why must you interrupt education? She added, quote, protest is never convenient for the people being protested against. The real question is, when is it time for justice? If it is really justice we seek, it's always the right time. Good point, Ms. Cooper. A 2015 study found that white Americans are less likely than non-white Americans to say that protests by black Americans are good for the country. Less likely. This remained true when the researchers evaluated responses by race and religion. They found that 65% of white Christians agreed that when Americans in general speak up and protest unfair treatment by the government, it always makes the country better. 62% of non-white Americans said the same thing. So just about the same. But change the race of the people protesting, and the responses look significantly different. Only 44% of white Christians agreed that when black Americans speak up and protest unfair treatment by the government, it always makes the country better. Only 44%, a 20-point drop. About 63% of non-white Christians agreed. White Christians are also less likely than Christians of color to understand the discrimination that minorities face. Studies have shown that white Christians are generally less likely than other religious groups and the unaffiliated to say that black Americans experience significant discrimination. They're less likely. White Christians are less likely to observe and state what's right goddamn in front of their faces. While 36% of white evangelical Protestants say there is a lot of discrimination against black Americans in the U.S. today, 86% of black Protestants say the same. 36%. That means 64% of white evangelical Protestants say there's not a lot of discrimination against black folk. White evangelical Protestants were particularly likely to say that police officers treat blacks the same as whites. These are white evangelical Christians. They're the only major religious group, white evangelical Protestants, in which a majority, 57%, say the police killings of black men in Ferguson, New York, and Baltimore were isolated incidents. On the other hand, 70% of minority Protestants say that these police killings were part of a broader pattern. The Reverend Jacqueline Lewis, senior minister of New York City's Middle Collegiate Church, told Huffington Post that she believes that flag is a symbol of the freedoms that the country claims to uphold. Freedom to drive, work, and live while black, vote while black, raise children while black, safely. But America isn't there yet. Reverend Lewis said, quote, "I think the deeper issue is that for African Americans in this nation, that flag and that national anthem are only as sacred as the willingness of those who sing and salute to stand up for the lives of all Americans, to stand up against white supremacy, the white supremacy that built this land on the backs of enslaved Africans after stealing it from First Nation peoples." Sounds like what we've talked about in this program so many times. And why do you suppose, Truth Seeker, this is just a review question, why do you suppose that so much attention right now is being focused on racial issues? That's kind of a bland term, racial issues, including the murder of black men who may have been charged with a crime, but are still in the process of just being goddamn arrested. And the continuing treatment of Americans of color with state-sanctioned discrimination, whether it's voting rights, education rights, employment rights. I mean, pick one. And whatever you do, my white brother, my white sister, if you're going to come back at me and say, yeah, but what about, and you name somebody who's black, who happens to be the CEO of a company. Well, my answer to that's the exception that proves the rule. What percentage of CEOs are either black or female, or, God help us, both? But the reason all of this is coming up now, as far as I'm concerned, is because of this racist bastard that we have as president. And I think the fact that 63 million people voted for this piece of shit speaks volumes about where this country is. Now, granted, those 63 million only represent, as far as the overall population is concerned, about 20% of people of voting age, people not of voting age. It's 330 million of us roughly in this country, so 63 million voted for this orange asshole. It's about 20% of the population, which to me means it represents two things. First of all, if only 20% of us will vote for somebody who has demonstrated over and over again that he's a racist, a Nazi, a white supremacist, an idiot, an ignorant man, a stupid man, a man who knows shit. If only 20% of the entire population will vote for that creature, that gives me a little bit of hope. On the other hand, the fact that 20% did vote for him is an indication to me that one of the stimulations, whatever, that will get white people to the polls is the dog whistle bullshit that white people fully understand. Oh, we get it. When the candidate is a racist and, in these times, even more or equally threatening, a Nazi. So, hope on the one hand about 63 million people voting for this piece of shit, and fear on the other hand that 63 million people voted for him.